So tonight, I'm pleased to introduce Thomas Abt, Politics and Prose. Abt is a senior research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Previously, he served as a policymaker in Barack Obama's Justice Department and worked for New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, overseeing all criminal justice and homeland security agencies in the state. In Bleeding Out, Abt proposes a concrete, cost-effective plan to stem urban violence that focuses on the violence itself, not drugs, gangs, or guns. By combining all these strategies, Abt's plans reduces homicides by over 50% in 8 years, saving more than 12,000 lives nationally and unlocking the untapped potential of our city's most disadvantaged communities. Abt's solutions are understandable as well as practical, and Bleeding Out challenges its readers to demand action. Jill Lavoie, author of Ghettoside, A True Story of Murder in America, writes, Bleeding Out is a readable guide for newcomers and a corrective for academics, establishing that urban violence truly is our greatest criminal justice problem. Abt knows what matters. Neither the get tough rhetoric from the right nor the denial on the left really address what ails urban poor people as they struggle with violent crime. Now, please join me in welcoming Thomas Abt.
Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to Politics and Prose for hosting. Thanks to all the friends and family and colleagues who are here. And also thanks to everyone who is not socially obligated to be here and is just here merely out of interest. I'm going to do a little bit of reading. They generally say don't do reading, but it's my party and I'll read if I want to. But thankfully, I'm going to keep it pretty short. And so what I'm hoping is that I'll talk for about maybe 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll just have an extended conversation between all of us to get everybody's feedback and comments, criticisms, and questions. All right. So I'm going to begin with a section from the book. I've known Kim Odom for years. She is a co-founder of Operation Lipstick, a first-of-its-kind effort in Boston that works to prevent firearms trafficking by helping women refuse to buy or store guns for the men in their lives. When Kim speaks, her voice carries an undeniable authority, amplified by her natural charisma and charm. Warmth and goodness seem to emanate naturally from her and her husband, Ronald, both of whom are pastors. When she talks about violence, however, people listen extra closely, because she speaks from her own broken heart. Kim's son, Stephen Odom, was murdered on October 4th, 2007. He was 13 years old. Stephen was an innocent bystander. He and his friends were walking home from a basketball game when they were mistakenly targeted by gang members. Shots rang out. Stephen fell. When Kim and I sat down to talk, it had been almost exactly 10 years since the murder. Kim had told Stephen's story many times before, but she still recounted it in fits and starts. Her voice cracked, her eyes watered, she took deep breaths. She broke down and cried, recovered, then cried again. Kim remembered the little things about that terrible evening. I heard 4 shots. They sounded like firecrackers. I looked out the window and saw a basketball rolling down the street. It came to rest at the tires of our car. When she went to investigate, she saw what no parent should ever have to see: her beautiful son lying in the street, shot in the head. Kim's mind went blank. Later in the hospital, a nurse had the nerve to comment that she seemed calm. "I'm not calm," she replied. "I'm numb." For weeks after Stephen's death, Kim couldn't eat or sleep. She could barely even get out of bed. Not only was she numb, she was immobilized with grief. 10 days after the murder, the young man suspected of killing Stephen was murdered himself. He was 18. Another young man who was with the alleged killer at the time was shot and paralyzed a few years later. He was 20 and will spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. Finally, the boy who provided the gun to the killer was arrested, prosecuted, and sentenced to 6 to 8 years in prison. He was 16. People asked Kim whether she was happy with what happened to the young men involved in the death of her son. Kim was shocked, almost offended by these questions. Happy? We're not happy. We're heavy. My husband and I are preachers. We preach and teach forgiveness. We feel heavy because now there are 4 families that are suffering from the pain of this vicious cycle of violence. Since September 11th, 2001, hundreds of Americans have died in terrorist attacks and mass shootings, but more than 100,000 have perished on the streets of our cities. Urban violence accounts for the majority of murders in the United States, yet politicians talk around the issue, focusing on everything but the violence itself. Ban guns, legalize drugs, and poverty. Anything less seems like an act of political surrender. Such absolutes sound good, but based on my review of more than 1,400 individual studies on crime and violence, these broad approaches tend not to solve what is in reality a very serious, but also quite narrow problem. A central feature of urban violence is its stickiness, meaning that it clusters in a surprisingly small number of people around a surprisingly small number of people and places. In New Orleans, a tiny network of less than 1% of the city's population accounted for more than 50% of all its lethal encounters. In Boston, more than 70% of shootings over a 3-decade period were concentrated in less than 5% of the city's geography. This is true in all cities all around the country, creating a challenge for so-called root cause responses to urban violence. A few guns in the hands of the riskiest people and carried in the riskiest places drive the vast majority of shootings and killings. In every city, a small number of violent drug dealers and addicts stand out from the rest. The more we fetishize guns and drugs, the more we miss opportunities to intervene with the limited number of people and places that drive the majority of the violence. Even the link between poverty and violence is not as strong as one might think. After all, the poor are many and the violent are few. In fact, evidence shows that the connection may be stronger in reverse. Exposure to violent trauma suppresses the academic performance of many disadvantaged children, negatively affecting their future earnings and prompting researchers to describe violence as, quote, the central mechanism, unquote, that is keeping poor kids poor today. If inadequate education, employment, housing, and health are threads in the knot of concentrated poverty, then violence is the fist that pulls those strings tight, making them impossible to tease apart. Now, here's the surprising good news. If we focus on urban violence itself and on the people and places where it concentrates, we can have peace in the streets today without waiting for new laws or big budgets. Here's just one example of how targeted programming can get transformative results. In Oakland, a group of community members, social service providers, and law enforcement officials called Oakland Ceasefire intervened with approximately 400 of the highest risk individuals, about 0.1% of the city's population, by making genuine offers of assistance along with warnings about the consequences of future violence. Then they followed up, providing life coaching, job training, and educational opportunities, along with narrowly targeted enforcement actions against those who persisted in violent offending. When researchers examined the effort and compared Oakland's performance to similar cities, they determined that the initiative had cut homicides by nearly in half since 2012. Oakland Ceasefire is modeled on Operation Ceasefire, the approach that was credited with reducing youth homicides in Boston during the 1990s by more than 60%. A review recently reported that the ceasefire strategy had been rigorously studied on 12 occasions, earning positive results each time. In each instance, police-community partnerships confronted those at the highest risk of violence with a message of empathy and also accountability, telling them the shooting must stop. If you put down the guns, we're here to help you. If you do not, we're here to stop you. To successfully and sustainably reduce violence, policymakers should put together a small portfolio of programs like Ceasefire that are focused, balanced, and fair. The best anti-violence efforts use social networking and crime mapping, among other tools, to focus attention and resources on the people and places that need them the most. They also balance treatment and support with accountability, using both carrots and sticks to change behavior. Finally, any anti-violence effort that hopes to succeed over time must be seen as fair and legitimate by the communities that are most impacted by arrests, incarceration, and of course the violence itself. By following these fundamental principles, focus, balance, and fairness, And by combining several evidence-informed strategies into one coordinated effort, homicides rates can be reduced by 10% a year. If you add up those reductions over 8 years, just 2 mayoral or presidential terms, you can see homicides cut in half. If Washington, D.C. fully embraced such an effort like this year, by 2028, almost 370 murders would be prevented. If this nation implemented this effort across its 40 most violent cities, more than 12,000 lives would be saved. And because these efforts are so tightly targeted, they are also relatively inexpensive, costing a fraction of 1% of local or federal budgets. I know it's hard to believe that solutions to such allegedly intractable problems are actually in reach, but the evidence doesn't lie. Metaphorically speaking, whether the patient is a young man suffering from a gunshot wound, a community riddled with such injuries, or a nation filled with such communities, the treatment should be the same. First and foremost, stop the bleeding. Almost exactly 10 years after Stephen's death, Kim and Ronald went to a cookout. When they arrived, a woman they didn't recognize got up abruptly and left. A few minutes later, she returned and approached them. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said awkwardly. They thanked her and she left again. It all seemed a bit strange, but Kim and Ronald thought little of it until a friend told them who the woman was. It was the mother of the boy who had allegedly murdered Stephen. A few minutes passed, and then her friend told Kim that the woman was outside, waiting. If she and Ronald wanted to talk to her, they could. Kim and Ronald went outside, the woman was standing there, and they hugged. Kim described it to me. She's crying, we're crying. "I always wanted to talk to you," I told her. "I always wanted you to know we don't hold any ill feelings." She kept saying, "It hurts, it hurts." And I said, "I know it does." Then as we're talking, I realized that just as we're getting to come up on 10 years without Stephen, she's coming up on 10 years too, because her son was murdered 10 days after Stephen died. I told her, this is complicated, but both of our sons' lives mattered. She hugged us and said, "Thank you," and then she left. The city of Boston is building a Serenity Garden in Stephen's honor, just a block or two away from the Odom's home in Dorchester. On a cold and gray afternoon in December, just before this book was finished, Kim and I visited the site. Work wasn't finished, but there was a gravel yard, 2 benches, several potted plants. It felt peaceful. We sat down and talked. I asked Kim why she remained so close to issues that were so hurtful to her and Ronald. "It's too important to give up," she told me. "When you share your story and someone lets you know it helped them, that's the blessing. That's the reward." I thought for a moment. Kim and I had met for the first time about a decade before, when the memory of Stephen's death was recent and raw. Her story had moved me deeply. I turned to Kim and thanked her. I said that without her, I might not have stayed focused on the issue of urban violence. I might not have even written this book. Kim smiled, and her eyes glazed over with tears. Mine did too. We sat for a moment in silence, listening to the wind. So, questions, thoughts, comments? I promise to end our Q&A on a more uplifting note. Yes.
Locally, are you aware of, conversant with the east of the river police clergy community partnership?
Not specifically.
Okay, well, I was going to ask, I assumed that we probably were aware of it. I was going to ask you about if that partnership were effective, but if you don't know about it, I guess you can't answer that question.
I guess I can't answer that specifically. I can say that police clergy partnerships are often sort of an essential bridge building exercise that often is necessary for these types of work. That's true not just in the United States, but in other places around the world. And so those relationships are often essential. They're not a panacea, but they often build this larger sense of collective efficacy for which the other interventions can be based.
I have two questions. First, I remember from many years back, before social networking and stuff like that, that there would be open air drug markets, and there would be the police would know that there were specific places where they needed to keep coming by. And when there was an effort to focus on these hotspots, they would just move. They wouldn't stay where, they would notice the people there would notice the increased police activity and, was in the papers, and they'd just go someplace else to conduct their business. And another thing is, how do you identify the people? It's easy to identify them once they've been arrested and they're in prison. That sounds to be more difficult. And it doesn't get to the new people who are the young people who are growing up and constantly coming in. So how do you find them in time?
Yeah. Thank you. Those are both excellent questions. So the first is really addresses a very common conception that crime is sort of like a balloon. You squeeze on one end and then it expands on the other. And we have, there has been a sort of a common understanding that if you focus on violence in one place, that it'll just move around the corner. Fortunately, we now have 3 decades of social science research stating that, in fact, that's not the case. There's something sticky about certain blocks, certain corners, certain locations. And it is true that some crime, when you focus on those locations, is dislocated and moves. But overall, crime is reduced. And actually, neighboring areas and neighboring neighborhoods actually benefit when those hotspots approaches are used. So that's the answer to your first question.
Right.
To your second question, I think for people on the outside, they think that there's sort of a deep mystery to who these individuals are. But if you've been working in this area for a while, all the people who are driving this violence are well known to both the members of the community and to the law enforcement. Many of them have been shot multiple times. They have long, serious criminal histories. They have reputations that precede them in multiple communities. And so it's really not hard to identify who they are. It's a matter of doing some obvious things in terms of reviewing homicide case files, making relationships with community members and talking to them about things. And I think it's very important because unless you do that, you fail to distinguish between in a, quote unquote, it's an important point that in a quote unquote dangerous community, the vast majority of people, even the vast majority of young men, are not dangerous. So you need to do your due diligence to identify those people, but it can be done.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hello. I have
Hi.
2 questions also. The first has to do with the program that the woman started where women would agree not to allow guns to be stored in their homes. I forget the name of it.
Operation Lipstick.
Yeah, could you say a little bit more about that? And the second question is, so I'm intrigued with how you approach one of the potential invitees to this party. So how does that work? Are you sending, this is a little facetious, but you're sending a letter saying, come on in, we're having a raffle. How do you entice people to come? There's no stick, is there?
Well, it's a great question. Let me take the second question first. So there is a bit of a stick because to the woman's previous question, because so many of these individuals are already deeply involved with the criminal justice system, many of them are on probation or parole. So you can make it a condition of their probation or parole that they have to appear at these meetings. Also, in some cases, they're approached and asked to come voluntarily. And people say, hey, this is in your best interest. You should come, And sometimes they surprisingly do. So that's how you get people to those particular meetings. Also, often the invitation or the request is coming from someone that they trust. Often, potentially someone who is formerly involved in criminal activity but is now out, but is serving as sort of a bridge.
Right.
And then Operation Lipstick basically focuses on what's known as straw purchasing, or it's not really a term, straw carrying, but you get the idea, where basically men who are involved in criminal activity use the women in their lives to help them get and hide firearms. And so this is a small effort in Boston trying to, and it really goes deeper than that. They really share a lot of stories of personal trauma, and they go far beyond that. But the main area is the straw carrying, and so that's a part of the problem they're working on. Now, it's not a panacea. Not all weapons are received through straw purchasing, but it's part of the solution.
Thank you.
Hi.
Yeah, hi. Thank you. I always have to start by saying I'm not from the United States. I'm from the Caribbean. Grew up in the Netherlands before I came here. I think you ask a very important question. Why, if this program is seemingly so successful, why there's not a greater buy-in across the United States in such a program, right? I think that deserves a answer, and I would like to give you the answer. Plus, I would like to say a little something about a program. When I was in School of Criminology at the University of Utrecht in Holland, I came up with an idea of what I call liberation criminology.
Okay. Are you going to make it quick?
The second one can't be made quick, so I mightn't talk about it. But the answer to the question, I think, is the following. I mean, and this could be provocative for United States citizens, right, for North American. The issue is, can the United States really have and afford to have real peace in the inner city, right? I mean, violence in the inner city is often self-controlling, right? If I'm a political activist or a young intellectual in the inner city, and I'm looking across at you and you're looking across at me across the window, I have my gun, you have your gun. We are not going to come together and go downtown and start to organize protests against the socioeconomic, racist conditions, racist justice situation, right? We are going to keep each other on a contract. If we are being overrun by drugs, another thing that basically keeps people there. If you were to put, in essence, my answer is such a program, if it would lead to stabilizing of life and conditions in the inner city, right, might lead inner city people at a certain point to decide that their life is no good. And they therefore have to massively organize protests. I mean, you haven't had much protests since the 1960s, right? Violence was less in inner cities in the 1960s than it later became. And so the issue is that one of the why there might not be a buy-in is that it isn't really nobody's interest, and especially in the dominant population interest to bring about these type of things. That might be somewhat cynical, right? But I think there could be some truth to it. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a very interesting point. And this is a you've sort of given a sort of more provocative version of a common view, which is that if you're going to address urban violence, you're going to have to first cure poverty. You're going to have to first address inequality. You're going to have to first deal with racism. And clearly, all of those things are contributing factors. But the evidence is quite clear that if there was one sort of sentence, it's if you want to reduce violence in urban America, you should focus first directly on the violence and not on all of these root causes. And the argument that I'm making, which is also a provocative one, is that I'm a committed progressive. Many of the people in this audience might be as well. We progressives are very good at drawing connections between these structural factors and crime and violence, but we only look at them in one causal direction. But they're actually flowing back and forth. And the evidence is actually quite strong that violence is playing a key role in perpetuating poverty. And so I would say that the evidence is much more optimistic. While I sort of think that we need to carry on with our struggles to reduce inequality and improve, social and economic equity in the United States, we can save lives right now at the same time.
I have a question for you that you might find uncomfortable, but I've asked you many such questions in the past.
This is Lori Robinson, my former boss.
Is that better? Oh, I see.
That's right.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. The uncomfortable question, potentially. The question of criminal justice and crime and how to address it seems to, more than in the past in recent years, to be a topic that may be addressed in the upcoming presidential elections. Are the proposals that you are advancing in this book ones that you either have or plan to pitch to any of the presidential candidates? And if you already have, what has been the reception to them?
Sure. So the book has just come out, so I have yet to pitch them. Also, when you do these books, you also sort of, your publicity department sort of organizes a series of op-eds. So there will be an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal in a couple days, and then another one in the Boston Globe, specifically addressing this issue. So then you forward, Lori, as you know, you forward them along to your friends, and then they pass them along, and then maybe you have a conversation. So no, I haven't done that work yet. I definitely intend to, but I do believe that there's this deep irony in the world of violence reduction, which is that the most successful anti-violence initiatives were all developed and championed by progressives. David Kennedy, a progressive. Gary Slutkin, who founded Cure Violence, a progressive. And yet the top tier of political leadership, of progressive leadership, is deeply uncomfortable with this issue. And I hope to urge them to be less uncomfortable with it, because what I worry about is that if progressives say nothing about urban violence, then there's only fear-mongering and divisiveness coming from Trump, who will speak directly to it in a way that I think is deeply counterproductive.
Thank you.
All right, another Caribbean commentary, which is kind of rare to have two back-to-back,
Sure.
more or less. Doesn't normally happen at Politics and Prose. But you speak very much about, in a sense, the behavioral dimension, about changing crime and violence. What economic development do to actually make that impact? Because you speak very much, yes, there are behavioral interventions and sort of social interventions that will do something. Is there any research that shows what economic development would do in certain communities to also change crime and violence? What's the R squared for the behavioral, and what's the R squared for economic development?
Right. So a real sort of proxy for these questions, if you're asking me about, well, will this mentoring program work? Will this jobs program work? Will this economic development program work? The first thing I'm going to ask you is, how targeted is it? Is it focusing on the very small number of people who are driving the violence in your jurisdiction? Is it focused on the very small number of hotspots, not entire communities? I want it targeted down to the block level that is responsible for these things. And then I'm going to ask, is your intervention meeting people where they're at? Meaning, if you have a generalized education program or a generalized employment program, that is not going to work with the most highly traumatized segment of the population that's been through hell and back. You need a much more resilient program. You need relentless outreach. You really need to engage. Sandra.
Hi, Thomas.
Hi.
You were a prosecutor, and you may know that there is what I hope is a wave of progressive lefty prosecutors in our area. There are two that won in the primaries in Northern Virginia recently, and they're really criminal justice reform oriented. There's a lot of talk. Usually, I don't need the mic. There's a lot of talk about expunging marijuana convictions and not prosecuting, but there's very little talk about how to be a progressive prosecutor focused on violence reduction, right? So given that you were a prosecutor, what is your advice to progressive prosecutors about what their obligations and duties and priorities ought to be on the prosecutorial side?
I think the main obligation of prosecutors in this area is to be part of the team. prosecutors are trained. I was trained. You are the chief law enforcement officer. You control the entire case, and if you don't, bad things happen. And so, a good prosecutor is actually trained to dominate every interaction that they're part of. That doesn't really work in this area, because at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is get ahead of the violence, not merely react to it. So what you want is a prosecutor who approaches this issue with a little bit of humility and who will say, let me sit down with the police, let me sit down with the community members. I know that I have a constructive piece in this puzzle where I use discretion to divert the right people out of the system, but to hold certain people accountable. That's the sort of posture that we need.
Thomas,
Hi.
so I would like to go to the Caribbean. So I'd like to talk to someone later. One of the things that I was really interested in was what you were saying about things feeling fair. And that's not something we often hear about in law enforcement policy. And that seemed to be one of the driving forces of how these programs needed to look. Can you talk a little bit more about what fairness looks like, feels like?
Sure. Thank you for that question. So it's the third sort of fundamental of reducing violence, which is that if people don't perceive, and by people I mean impacted communities, if they don't perceive what you're doing as being legitimate, you might have temporary success, but overall, you're not likely to succeed. And so creating legitimacy is a very difficult task. I spent a tremendous amount of time synthesizing all of the most rigorous evidence on anti-violence interventions. And on the principle of focus and on the principle of balance, the evidence was quite strong, and I would say compelling. The evidence on legitimacy is merely promising because we are continuing to study it, and it's encouraging, but the body of evidence is not as big yet. But I think that the most encouraging part of this research comes out of the sort of area of procedural justice, which basically says that if you engage with impacted people and communities and you treat them fairly, you treat them respectfully, you give them a voice, not just in the individual encounter, but in the policymaking process, and you're transparent about why you're doing things, you can slowly build legitimacy. I'll give you an example. There's a famous intervention called the Kansas City Gun Project that happened in the 90s. And it's basically a pretty aggressive sort of stop and search, stop and frisk program. And so based on our recent experience, you might expect that this was a very unpopular program, but you'd be wrong. And the reason that you'd be wrong is because the Kansas City police did something very unusual. Before the program started, they went door to door in the community, and they told every single person that they could find about what they were doing, why they were doing it, how it would work, what they could expect. And they didn't have any community resistance because the community, if they had not been fully involved, was at least informed, and at least the issue was described. And this is something that's very important. Nobody wants state power to be used arbitrarily upon them. And so if people perceive the process by which state power is exercised as more fairly, they're more likely to accept that exercise of power, even if it doesn't always go their way.
Thomas, you've alluded several times to Operation Ceasefire and various variations on it. And as you yourself said, David Kennedy and others have been promoting this for at least 25 years, and it's been successful in various places. So the obvious question to me is, why don't more places do it? I mean, I'll offer a few ideas, and you can comment on them. Is it too labor intensive to organize? Is it hard to keep going? You do it once, and is it hard to keep going over a period of years? Is there any real opposition to it? Do some police departments think it's no good despite the academic studies, or is it just pure ignorance that you and other people here know about it, but it just, even after 25 years, the word really isn't out? But those are some of my ideas, but what are your ideas?
Sure. I think all of those observations have merit. I think the main thing is that focused deterrence or Operation Ceasefire or hotspots policing or cognitive behavioral therapy or urban greening, all of these different things that I talk about in the book, none of them really reinforce most people's political priors. They're not totally soft on crime. They're not totally tough on crime. They challenge everybody a little bit. They challenge progressives to acknowledge that there's a limited role for law enforcement. They challenge conservatives to acknowledge that, we need a far more robust intervention and prevention component on these things. And so they don't go down so easy. And so in my experience, when I have pitched these proposals to mayors, governors, and even at the White House, people don't disagree with you on the evidence, Ted. They don't say, no, you're wrong. They just kind of go, and you can see they're kind of struggling like, I don't know how to sell that. And frankly, that's the reason I wrote this book, and that's the reason I wrote it for a mainstream audience. I didn't want to speak to just, my little group of people who already got it. I wanted to sort of speak to the bosses so they would tell their people in Washington or people in their city halls, hey, have you tried this? This looks promising.
Maybe I'll ask a little more. I think you sort of answered my question when you were responding to Ted Guest there, but I'd like to ask a little bit more about that. When you go to the White House and they don't feel like they can sell it, I'm not getting that. Can you talk a little bit more about progressives like Gary Slutkin and David Kennedy, and those guys know how to sell their projects? Why is it that the projects are not taken up by elected leaders more so?
So, I sort of thought about this. I thought about this very much the same way because, you and I are sort of insiders in this community. And so we've witnessed them pitch these proposals. We find it very persuasive. They're very well known in our community. And actually, when I started my chapter sort of on, why haven't these efforts been scaled up, I sort of began with this sort of premise that, we know what works, so why don't we use it? Mm-hmm. But when I started thinking about it more, that we is really quite small. It's a few hundred people spread out across the United States. It's, very much among a cluster of people who are, very experienced, very skilled, and knowledgeable in this area. And we're all in conversation with each other. So it feels like everybody out there knows these things, but they actually don't. And I have hit many a brick wall when I go outside of my community and I assume, Mr. Mayor, you know about no, I don't know about this. And in fact, I think all you need to do is jobs, or I think all you need to do is education, or you need to do is drugs or guns or gangs. And so actually we have a much broader persuasion task than we think. And that's, again, why I'm putting the book out there. Hey.
Hi, Thomas. I have two questions.
Sure.
I think one kind of builds on what people are saying. Thank you for writing this. Obviously, I haven't had a chance to read it, but all my heroes are in it, so that's always a good sign. Thinking about the kind of getting progressives to understand or get serious about this body of work. And I think Papa Christos, who is quoted in here, one time said at a meeting I was at, is that we have to get people to care about Black and brown boys dying. And that's because that's who's dying, right? So that's who's bleeding out. And many people don't experience the effect of this violence in their day-to-day life, definitely not in this neighborhood, but in a lot of the rooms that you're probably having these conversations in. So that's one. I don't know if that's spelled out at all in this book, but that's one challenge that I feel comes up often when talking about doing this work. And then secondly, I wanted to ask you to just explain a little bit more that kind of reverse connection that you said between violence and poverty.
Sure.
I feel like I think I understand that intellectually, but that's something that I feel like isn't talked enough about, is the connection between violence and poverty and in the other way. So thanks.
Right. Thank you. So I'm relying here largely on the work of Pat Sharkey, used to be at NYU and is now transitioning over to Princeton. Here's the causal pathway of how it works. Let's just take a young boy is growing up in, let's just say Anacostia. And he's exposed to high rates of abuse in his family. He has an abusive uncle who's really hard on him, XYZ. He leaves his house and goes when he's out in the community and there's gun violence in the community. He witnesses this. He's had family members shot and killed. He's been present when there are shootings and all of these things. And then he's enrolled in school, and to and from school, he's exposed to these stresses and even has stresses in the home. And then he's expected to be calm and stay focused and stay disciplined and not act out. When all of the empirical evidence shows that if you are exposed to high levels of chronic stress, which is what's happening, these are little kids suffering from PTSD essentially, you find it harder to focus. You can't sleep. You get more impulsive. You get irritable. All of these different things. And so basically what happens is all of that chronic stress deeply impacts these kids' abilities to perform in school. Once they don't perform well in school, that impacts a lifetime of future earnings. And that's how it really inhibits their upward mobility. And that's why, according to studies like the one that Raj Chetty has done, is you can have kids from equally poor neighborhoods, and the kids from a poor but less violent neighborhood do much better than the kids from the poor but violent neighborhood. And then, I think we just have to be real about this, and it's uncomfortable. But if this was happening to white kids, even poor white kids, we'd have fixed this. There wouldn't be a solution within reach that we just somehow can't get to. Somebody would say to, progressives and conservatives, they'd say, I don't care what your priors are, fix it right now. They would push for that. And it's something that I sort of worry about in this sort of broader conversation. In the criminal justice conversation about race, we're often focused on this sort of concept of racial animus, white people or white law enforcement officers sort of hating other people, being brutally discriminatory. But, 20 years of experience in the trenches of criminal justice, and I really see white people damaging poor black people through their apathy, much more than through their animus, by just quietly looking the other way and silently redirecting their attention and their influence and their support elsewhere. And I use a model in the book of a woman who really began in that place and then was really transformed in a very conscientious way. And she's here today and has really done a tremendous amount of work. I don't know if she wants to identify herself, so I won't name her, but there's a story about that in the book.
Hello. My question is, you talk about that 10% annual decrease in violence that kind of culminates in the 50% total decrease. And so my first question is, has there been longitudinal evidence to suggest that the effect definitely tapers off at 50%, or is that kind of a theoretical projection? And then my second question is, what is it about that 50% mark and the state of things when you get to 50% that makes this method suddenly ineffective, and what would you do afterwards?
Oh, no. There's no magic to it, and I'm not suggesting that there is a tapering off. I mean, if you look at the New York City miracle or what's happened in L.A. or other places, you can have, 20-year sustained, or Colombia, Medellin, for instance. You can have sustained decreases. But I'm trying to be practical and sort of suggest a reasonable time frame, because the whole point of the book was not to make a ridiculous ask to the American public or to policymakers. I didn't want to say, give me all your attention, all your time, all your resources, and then I'll fix violence. Because as a policymaker, you get those asks all the time, and it's just fundamentally unrealistic. And so what's unusual about the book is the book says we can make a big difference on this in a relatively short period of time with not that much resources and not, a relatively small ask.
Just a quick one about Latin America, if I may. You talked a little bit there, you referred to Colombia, and I was curious how your work with initiatives and reviewing data in Latin America may have fed into having a different lens on solutions in the United States. Were there any specific projects or works that you saw and experienced in Latin America that may have fed into how you wrote about the solutions here?
Sure. Thank you. It's a great question, and I do spend some time in Latin America, and I've actually been commissioned to write sort of an additional chapter of this book specifically aimed at Latin America and the Caribbean. And so what I find sort of interesting about Latin America is many of the issues of sort of impunity and legitimacy and all of these things are present in many of the high violence countries in Latin America, but at such a more extreme level. If you are not familiar with the sort of with what's going on in El Salvador right now, or in Brazil, or in Jamaica or Trinidad, it really is sobering, and it really gives you a sense of perspective over the United States problems. But there are a lot of similar dynamics. The one thing I would say that's fundamentally different is in the United States, you can write a book that's essentially about programmatic innovation and say, you can make a big difference right now without reforming all of the institutions. I think in Latin America, institutional and systemic reform is so necessary, with impunity rates as high as 90 or 95%, blatant corruption, blatant brutality, that the institutional reform is not something that kind of can be deferred until later.
Hi, thank you for your work. You make a really compelling case for describing the evidence behind this really targeted carrot and stick approach, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to what the stick should look like, because I think what we know from a large other body of evidence is that what are traditionally considered kind of tough on crime or accountability policies aren't particularly effective in deterrence, and in terms of incapacitation, sentence length isn't necessarily correlated with improved outcomes for recidivism, and so in this particular context, I'm wondering what you see as the best role of whether you call it punishment or consequences for those specific individuals.
Sure. I think it sounds like from your question, you're probably already familiar with this sort of body of research, but most of the research into deterrence really suggests that deterrence has three elements: swiftness, certainty, and severity. And it turns out that the swiftness of a punishment, and especially the certainty of the punishment, are much more important to deterrence than the severity. And this is why the death penalty does nothing to deter crime, because it's a very severe punishment, but it's totally uncertain whether you'll get it, and you get it many, many, many years down the line. So, for progressives who are uncomfortable with punishment, there's no way to get around it. You've got to be okay with these things. However, we should be much more thoughtful about how we punish, emphasizing swiftness and certainty over severity.
Hi, my question is about the role of outreach workers. In your book, it seems like outreach workers need to maintain some semblance of independence from traditional forces of authority in order to develop trusting relationships with those more likely to engage in violent behavior. How do they simultaneously maintain that independence that makes those relationships possible while connecting those more likely to engage in violent behavior with the resources that a group of nonprofits or community organizers, politicians, activists, prosecutors might be able to offer?
Right. Okay, so there's a lot in there. And you obviously know a lot about street outreach. So just to back up, street outreach, for those of you who haven't read the book, is when people go out into the community to affirmatively engage the individuals who are at the highest risk for violence. And most prominently, they engage in conflict mediation. They try to prevent retaliation. But I think that one of the underappreciated aspects of street outreach that we're now seeing more and more is that if you really want to deliver any type of intensive treatment or services to this population, you have to have a street outreach program. Meaning you have to literally go to their house, you have to coax them into it, then they don't show up, you have to go back. ROCA in Boston, a organization that uses cognitive behavioral therapy and employment training to get kids out, they have street outreach workers will literally pull someone out of a meth house to come back to the program. So I increasingly think that if you don't have some component of street outreach, you're kind of not serious. However, when you're talking about the conflict mediation side, there has to be this level of independence, because if people who are involved in violence think that you're going to talk to the police, at best they won't talk to you. At worst, they might do something to you. And so that level of independence is really important. But there's a fine line. And what we've seen is that sometimes when street outreach goes wrong, you don't have street outreach workers who are simply independent. They're actually adversarial. And they're actually telling people, don't work with the police, don't engage, don't do those things, just talk to me. And that's not constructive, because ultimately you want street outreach to really be building bridges, not sort of cementing these divisions in the community.
Yeah. Hey, Thomas.
Hi.
So if you look at the policies you're advocating for in this book, from group violence to street outreach, the carrot and stick local approaches, and then you look at the 5 or 10 cities that are most afflicted by urban gun violence, can you talk about the state of the implementation of those policies today and the delta between where you think we need to go and the magnitude of that?
Sure. That's a great question. So, if you go just up north to Baltimore, or even here in DC, or if you go to Detroit, or St. Louis, and you say, well, do these policies, they're going to go, we've done that. We tried that and it didn't work. And the answer is, well, you tried it a little and you didn't implement with fidelity and you didn't sustain it. One of the things that I see in these cities, this is also true of Chicago, though I'm hopeful that things are going to improve there, is that when you go into a city that's afflicted by high rates of violence, they're not doing everything else well and just suffering from high rates of violence. There's a collective incapacity in the state that's happening in every other aspect. And so one of the things that you need to be able to do to get these initiatives off the ground is you need to get a few key people to sort of buy in and sort of agree for at least a little while to sort of not go after each other, not be at each other's throats at the first sign of failure, and to build a somewhat resilient partnership. Because, focused deterrence does not always work. Ceasefire does not always work. And the number one reason it doesn't is because the partnership falls apart, because the people can't stay aligned and can't stay agreed. And so that's a very difficult thing. So one of the things that you've got to do in a city is you've got to sort of first find a way to make sure that the mayor, the police chief, a few prominent community leaders from impacted communities can kind of get in a room and stay in a room and share some core values, and can sort of have a relationship that's strong enough to survive one or two big shocks. A bad officer shooting, some other type of incident, a really violent weekend. Because if you can't do that, then you suffer from this sort of thing that I always call the whiplash effect in criminal justice, which is something terrible happens and you just knock all the pieces off and start over. And you really begin this terrible cycle of what I sort of believe is sort of performative criminal justice, where you sort of look like you're doing something, but you're not actually doing something. Or what you're actually doing is just very heavy enforcement.
Can I do a follow-up if there's no one else? It's like the debates. Okay,
yeah, there
follow-up
you go.
for you. So it sounds like in some cases the stars have to align. You have to have a political will, the budget, the police chief has to be a good person that wants to work with the clergy. so, and it's less like I need a highway, give me $1 billion, there's a highway, or I need a new law, no more trafficking of guns. Like, is it just political will, or do you really like? Is it like? Can you talk about the characteristics that need to be in place, and like what we could all collectively do to make that happen beyond the political will?
Sure. I mean, I think that the reason that this is achievable, while it's not easy, is that it's really a quality over quantity issue. You don't have to go to your mayor and say, give me a quarter of your budget. I costed it out for DC. Over 8 years, the programs that I'm recommending would cost $20 million. I know DC's budget is strapped. They've got that. They've absolutely got that. So it's not an unreasonable ask there. It's not an unreasonable ask in terms of staffing or in terms of these other things. But what you're asking people to do is very unusual. You're asking them to meet constantly across all these disciplinary across all these disciplines and sectors. And so that's a very new way of doing business. And so unless you have leaders who are telling sort of a few key people you have to do this, then no, it won't work. But you don't have to have everyone doing it. And in terms of political support, if you look at Oakland and how Oakland got this thing off the ground, there was a group of African-American clergy and other community leaders, not that big, who just beat up the city council and the mayor until they implemented ceasefire and insisted that they do it right. And that was not a big group. And so one of the sort of things that I point out in the book is I'd love to change the national conversation on urban violence. And I'd love everyone to care about this issue. But you don't actually need everyone to make a difference on this issue. You need a core constituency. It doesn't need to be big. It just needs to be loud. And, if a group the size, maybe not this size, but maybe twice the number of the people in this room decided that they are going to beat down the doors of City Hall and they're going to use their political capital and all of those things to insist that the city adopt these strategies, that's enough. And so, that's what I really want to get across is this issue is so terrible and so serious and tragic in so many ways. But it's not just about murder and death. It's also about preserving life and preserving joy. And it's achievable. It's doable. So that's the positive message that I promised at the beginning. Thank you.